Thank you for joining the Meridian Valley Lab webinar. I'm pleased to present today Dr. Pushpa Larsen, who graduated from Bastyr University with a doctorate in naturopathic medicine and certificates in naturopathic midwifery and spirituality, health, and medicine. She has worked as a research clinician for the Bastyr University Research Institute and as an affiliate clinical faculty for Bastyr University, training students in her clinic. She was in private practice in Seattle for 10 years before joining Meridian Valley Lab as a consulting physician 2 years ago. She consults with hundreds of doctors every year on the use and interpretation of 24-hour urine hormone profiles, as well as other tests offered by Meridian Valley Lab. She's a contributing author to Naturopathic Doctor News and Review on the topics of cardiovascular and hormone testing.
Thank you, and welcome to all of you out there. Welcome to the webinar. Thanks for joining us today. Just going to close my screen here so I can, here we go. Here we go. So today we're going to do a brief review of glucose-insulin metabolism, look at the origins of insulin resistance, and see how insulin resistance is a primary driver of the other features of metabolic syndrome. We'll also discuss how to best evaluate your patients for insulin resistance and look at some of the current best non-pharmaceutical treatments. And we'll have time for questions and answers. You're welcome to ask questions at any time. Just type your question in and I'll try to answer them as we go to the extent that I can. Also, at the end of the webinar, I'll give you the answer to the one question we always are asked. As a matter of fact, I've already been asked it this morning, and it is, how do I get a copy of today's slides? So I'll answer that at the end of the webinar. Metabolic syndrome, as I'm sure you know, is epidemic in the United States, affecting more than 50 million adults. Now this says 47 million adults, but I have even newer research since I wrote that slide. This puts these individuals at twice the risk of developing cardiovascular disease and a whopping 5 times the risk of progressing to diabetes. The incidence increases with age, which means that the older you are, the higher the likelihood that you'll develop metabolic syndrome. I didn't find any Canadian statistics for this, but I would imagine it would fall somewhere between Europe and the U.S. And the most unsettling statistic that I found is that 1 in 8 school children meet at least 3 of the criteria for metabolic syndrome, and we'll look at what those criteria are in a minute. These rates of metabolic syndrome by race and ethnicity are for U.S. populations. So the South Asians we're referring to here are South Asians living in the United States. Among African Americans and Mexican Americans, metabolic syndrome is more common in women than in men, but it's equally distributed between men and women among Caucasians. And we don't know why there is this gender difference in these other ethnic groups. Obesity is certainly a very important risk factor for metabolic syndrome, but not all obese people have metabolic syndrome, and we also shouldn't assume that someone doesn't have it just because they're not overweight. History, both family and personal, is important to consider in evaluating your patient's risk for metabolic syndrome. Those are just a few of the things you need to consider. And conditions other than cardiovascular disease that are associated with metabolic syndrome include fatty liver, gallstones, sleep apnea, and PCOS in women. And this is not an exhaustive list. I'm sure there are others. So we first think about insulin sensitivity and insulin insensitivity. Sir Harold Himsworth, who's an MD, in 1936 described 2 types of diabetics, insulin-sensitive types, which are now called type 1, and insulin-insensitive types, now called type 2. And then the concept of insulin resistance was first formulated by Gerald Reaven, a Stanford endocrinologist, in 1988. And he linked it to hypertension and high VLDL and a cluster of risk factors that he called Syndrome X. Since that time, Syndrome X has been called a number of things, including insulin-resistant syndrome, dysmetabolic syndrome, and has come to become known most commonly as just metabolic syndrome. And a number of other risk factors have been added to Revin's original cluster, including hypertriglyceridemia, increased free fatty acids, decreased HDL cholesterol, and microalbuminuria. A number of different definitions for metabolic syndrome have developed over the years. This table displays the criteria for metabolic syndrome as defined by the World Health Organization, the European Group for the Study of Insulin Resistance, the International Diabetes Foundation, and the National Cholesterol Education Program Adult Treatment Panel 3. And although by two of these definitions, the IDF and the NCEP definitions, a patient could be diagnosed as having metabolic syndrome even without impaired fasting glucose or other evidence of insulin resistance, we'll see that insulin resistance may be the driving pathology behind the other aspects of metabolic syndrome. So looking at these definitions, we can see that metabolic syndrome has four central features: insulin resistance, central obesity, endothelial dysfunction, and atherogenic dyslipidemia. In normal glucose insulin metabolism, insulin binds to its receptor, which initiates a cascade of events. Glucose transporter molecules are translocated to the surface of the cell, allowing glucose to be taken in. Insulin also stimulates glycogenesis and stimulates glycolysis and stimulates the building of free fatty acids. In normal insulin metabolism, we have these two parallel pathways. In the PI3K pathway, nitric oxide production is stimulated, which leads to vasodilation and increased delivery of insulin and glucose to the tissues. The MAP kinase pathway acts as a kind of brake on the PI3K pathway, counterbalancing some of its effects. This pathway stimulates the growth of vascular smooth muscle and promotes vasoconstriction. In insulin resistance, the PI3K pathway is inhibited and the MAP kinase pathway is not. Therefore, it becomes predominant. So of the four central features that we've mentioned earlier, insulin resistance seems to have a primary effect on the development of the other three. There seems to be a shared pathophysiology. Impaired insulin signaling reduces the activity of the PI3K pathway, reducing the production of nitric oxide, leading to endothelial dysfunction. That's one of the four primary features of metabolic syndrome. Similarly, impaired insulin signaling also results in increased apolipoprotein B, VLDL, and small dense LDL, thus atherogenic dyslipidemia, another feature of metabolic syndrome. And insulin resistance contributes to increased visceral adiposity, which seems to further impair insulin sensitivity in an ever-worsening cycle. So where does it all start? Okay, the first question here is, what are Merco, Furco, and Lurco? ERCO, without the M, F, or L, stands for insulin receptor knockout, and this designates strains of mice in which particular insulin receptor genes have been eliminated or deactivated. Merkel mice lost their insulin receptors in skeletal muscle tissue. They had reduced uptake of glucose into muscle, as you would guess, but their total body glucose management remained normal. Furco mice lost insulin receptors to adipose or fat tissue. They were protected against obesity, dyslipidemia, and glucose intolerance, and they had a prolonged lifespan. So insulin resistance at the level of skeletal muscle or adipose tissue alone does not seem to impact overall insulin sensitivity. But the Lurco mice, who lost their insulin receptors to their livers, exhibited all of the glucose dysregulation problems we see in insulin resistance and diabetes. Intrahepatic fat content is closely correlated with how much insulin an individual needs to maintain good blood sugar control. As you can see here, in looking at this in patients with diabetes, the more intrahepatic fat they had, the poorer their insulin sensitivity, and the more insulin they needed in order to maintain blood sugar control. In non-diabetic patients, intrahepatic fat content is strongly correlated with insulin resistance. And it's interesting to note that the correlation is much stronger than with other body fat, including visceral fat. In this study, it was included that ectopic fat in the liver may be more important than visceral fat in determining whether or not an obese individual will develop insulin resistance. There is evidence that the origins of insulin resistance may lie in the fetal environment. Substantially inadequate maternal nutrition may tune homeostatic mechanisms of the developing infant to prepare for an inadequate future environment. This promotes the development of a thrifty phenotype, and this mismatch between the anticipated and actual adult nutrient environment confers a greater susceptibility to metabolic syndrome in later life. In animal experiments, it was seen that animals exposed to a nutritional mismatch between fetal and adult environments develop a host of symptoms and conditions associated with metabolic syndrome. And animals exposed to nutritional, I'm sorry, I missed something there. Poor maternal nutrition can result in small B cell mass, pancreatic B cell mass at birth, which can have lifelong effects on glucose metabolism. Overnutrition can also have maladaptive effects, as we see in gestational diabetes and maternal obesity. Collectively, these data suggest that poor maternal diets may provide a common origin for the multifactorial disorder that is metabolic syndrome. And it suggests that if we truly want to address the causes of metabolic syndrome, we need to be doing much more than we are to educate women in their childbearing years on the long-term effects on their children of what they eat when they're pregnant, and working with them to maintain adequate and appropriate nutrition. Mitochondrial function appears to be a primary factor in the development of insulin resistance in diabetes. Damaged or mutated mitochondria lead to decreased insulin secretion. Depletion of mitochondrial DNA is associated with fewer glucose transport proteins. I guess I don't need to read this to you. You can read it. And as you can see, mitochondrial mutations that result in diabetes diabetes. There are more than 40 of them, and that appears to be associated with the proximity to reactive oxygen species produced by mitochondrial processes to the nuclear DNA, to the mitochondrial DNA. Mitochondrial DNA mutation is 10 to 25 times higher than that of nuclear DNA. As you can see here, mitochondrial abnormalities have always been associated in multiple ways with patients with diabetes, and there's no reason to expect that that would be different for patients with metabolic syndrome who have not yet progressed to diabetes. This provides a rationale for uses of antioxidants for diabetes and insulin resistance, and there have been observed benefits from doing so. Supporting mitochondrial function must be a key component of an approach to reducing insulin resistance, metabolic syndrome, and diabetes. Many hormones involved in metabolism have been shown to have a circadian oscillation. Here are a few of them here. Leptin, an adipocyte-derived circulating hormone that acts on receptors in the hypothalamus to suppress appetite and increase metabolism, exhibits striking circadian patterns in both gene expression and protein secretion, with peaks in the sleep phase. And in rats, melatonin decreased weight gain in response to a high-fat diet within 3 weeks. A large body of evidence has been accumulated that suggests that short sleep is associated with increased body mass index and increased incidence of type 2 diabetes. These studies show significant changes in energy metabolism after only a few days of partial sleep restriction. I was actually reading this review article late one night after midnight and found myself getting sleepier and sleepier as I read it, feeling like, oh, I really need to be asleep now, not doing this work. In this study, students were switched from daytime activity to nighttime activity, with their last meal shifted by about 4 hours. After only 3 weeks, the nighttime students were exhibiting greatly increased insulin levels and glucose levels. And of course, increased insulin levels would be associated with insulin resistance. Okay, what to look for in your patients? Well, some red flags are body mass index of more than 25, waist to hip ratio in men more than 0.9 and women more than 0.85, waist circumference in men more than 40 inches and women more than 35 inches. Gallstones, shift workers, sleep apnea, sedentary lifestyle. You can see all that there. Fasting glucose in the high normal range, fasting insulin more than 10, hemoglobin A1C more than 5.7. These are all red flags. But as we'll see, lower values for these markers don't rule out insulin resistance. A low testosterone to estrogen ratio in men. Now, on a 24-hour urine hormone profile for a man, we compare testosterone with total estrogens. And the testosterone to estrogen ratio is calculated by dividing testosterone by total estrogen. In this case, that yields a testosterone to estrogen ratio of 3.3. And a T to E ratio of less than 4 is associated with insulin resistance. I have a question here. The question is, what should the testosterone to estrogen ratio be in serum? Well, we don't have a similar ratio for serum levels, but in generally we would want to see estrogens in the mid-range to low normal and testosterone in the mid to high normal ranges. Men who come in complaining about the development of breasts are almost certainly over-aromatizing and should be evaluated for insulin resistance. Similarly with men who come in complaining about developing some central obesity, they're very likely over-aromatizing. Another red flag is high 5-alpha reductase activity, again on the 24-hour urine hormone panel. Values at the upper end of the scale are associated with obesity and insulin resistance in both men and women, and with PCOS in women. Values mid-range to low normal are what we want to see. High normal ALT and elevated CRP are also indicators that evaluating for insulin resistance would be prudent. And I see another question here. Do you run hemoglobin A1C for people as a routine lab? Yes, I do. I know that that's not necessarily the standard, although I'm seeing it more and more often. Certainly among practitioners that are practicing holistically, hemoglobin A1C is used much more commonly. When I was in school, we were told that you only run it on people who are diabetic, and that made no sense to me. It's like, why do you wait until they're diabetic to find out? Okay, testing for insulin resistance. Here are the American Diabetes Association criteria for diagnosing diabetes or impaired glucose tolerance, which they call prediabetes. But as we can see, these recommendations are designed to detect a condition that's already established, not to address prevention. Earlier detection of insulin resistance can obviously lead to earlier intervention and prevention. Meridian Valley Lab bases our glucose tolerance insulin response test on the work of Dr. Joseph Kraft. He was a pathologist who practiced at St. Joseph Hospital in Chicago for 35 years, and he studied patients who had been referred to him for a standard glucose tolerance test to evaluate for diabetes. In his seminal paper published in 1975 in the journal Laboratory Medicine, he reported on the results of a test of 3,650 patients. 53% of those patients were determined to be diabetic based on a glucose tolerance test, which is not surprising because that's what they were referred to him. There was some suspicion that they might be diabetic. That's why they were referred for a glucose tolerance test. But 47% were judged not to be diabetic based on glucose tolerance alone. Remember, this is before there was a category called prediabetes. You were either diabetic or you weren't. Now, of those that were considered negative based on glucose values, 33% were still considered not diabetic, or still not considered diabetic after the interpretation of the insulin values. However, a whopping 50% of these patients Dr. Kraft evaluated as having what he called diabetes in situ, what we would now call insulin resistance. Another 14% were borderline, and 2.5% had a low insulin response pattern that he described it as islet cell exhaustion. So these are people who are quickly needing to have exogenous insulin in order to manage their blood sugar. And yet, on the glucose tolerance test, these people were considered negative. Now, before I get into how we interpret the GTIR test, let me describe the logistics of the test. So first of all, patients fast for 8 to 12 hours prior to the test, nothing but water. Then there's a fasting specimen drawn. then the patient consumes a 100-gram glucose challenge. This is important. Specimens are drawn at 30 minutes, 1, 2, and 3 hours after the glucose challenge, and sometimes a 4-hour specimen is drawn. Glucose and insulin are tested on all 5 specimens, or 6 if we do 4 hours. Now, you can certainly ask your local lab to run a GTIR this way. You just have to be prepared to insist that they use a 100-gram glucose challenge and make sure they understand that they need to test for both glucose and insulin for all 5 draws and to run the test for 3 hours. Most labs use a 75-gram glucose challenge. That's standard right now. That's the ADA's, that's how they do a standard glucose tolerance test. But Dr. KRAFT'S research was done with a 100-gram glucose challenge, and that's what our test kits contain. If you draw blood in your office and send it to Meridian Valley, we'll graph it out. We'll graph the results for you, and we have some really great lab techs here who are very experienced in interpreting the results and identifying the patterns. Okay, so pattern 1, this is a normal pattern. Dr. KRAFT'S original criteria for a normal fasting insulin was less than 30. But we've adjusted that based on looking at results over the years and seeing that there were virtually no reports with a fasting insulin of more than 10 that had otherwise normal values. And this is also consistent with the current thinking that a normal fasting insulin should be less than 10. And some people even say less than 6. I have a question here that says, I wonder about the size differences between patients and the 100 grams. A 240-pound versus a 120-pound person. Yeah, we've had that kind of question before. It is important to use the 100-gram glucose challenge. Otherwise, we're not, if we are adjusting the dose for every person, and since we don't know how each person is handling their glucose before they get the test, we really don't know whether or not any variability we would see if we gave different doses would be based on the difference in the dose or the difference in their glucose metabolism and their insulin response. So it is very important to use the 100-gram glucose challenge. I know some people think that it's a lot, but honestly, it's not more than people are dealing with most of the time every day in their life from time to time, especially people who eat a fairly high carbohydrate diet. So it is something that it does work to do the 100-gram glucose challenge. Just one thing that I forgot to mention when I was going over the test, and I'll mention right now. Meridian Valley is in the process of developing this test as a finger stick test, as a blood spot test, so that you will be able to, if you don't draw blood in your office, this is something that you'll be able to do in your office. I don't know when that will be available. I was told today when I was getting ready to record the webinar, I found out today for the first time that we were going to be having this test. I think it's very exciting, and hopefully we'll have it out for you by the end of the year. Pattern 2 shows a slightly delayed return to normal for insulin as well as for glucose. If the second and third hour are between 60 and 100, it's classified as borderline insulin resistance. If it's more than 100, it's classified as definite insulin resistance. Pattern 3A has insulin peaking at the second hour. This might still be considered normal by ADA criteria if the 2-hour glucose is less than 140, as it is in this case. Pattern 3B, the insulin peaks at the third hour. Notice that the scale has changed here and that the glucose values are rising much higher before they're brought under control. And this is the first one that we've seen so far that would be considered abnormal according to ADA criteria because the 2-hour glucose is more than 200. In pattern 4, we see high fasting levels of insulin and glucose levels remaining high for much longer periods. It's taking a massive outpouring of insulin to get glucose levels under control. And in pattern 5, we see a low insulin response pattern. So all the tested values for insulin are less than 30. This is considered to be an insulinopenic pattern. If it's associated with high levels of plasma glucose, as it is here, this is considered to be insulin deficiency, probably because of dead or near dead islet cells. Occasionally, this pattern is seen with normal or borderline glucose tolerance, and this might be because of a low carbohydrate diet or low carbohydrate preparation. Dr. Wright notes that an insulinopenic response to this test can also indicate gluten sensitivity, especially in younger patients. So in that case, test with a stool specimen for secretory IgA anti-gliadin antibody. Okay, now that you've seen all the patterns, let's put them together and look at the progression from normal to insulin-dependent diabetes. The solid lines are insulin and the dotted lines are glucose. This is pattern 1, or the normal pattern. Notice how short a period of time glucose levels remain above 100, the cutoff for a normal fasting glucose. This is pattern 2. Glucose levels remain elevated slightly longer and the insulin peak is slightly delayed. In pattern 3A, there's a further delay in the insulin peak and glucose levels are creeping a little bit higher. And in pattern 3B, the insulin peak is significantly delayed and glucose levels are soaring. In pattern 5, the insulin starts high and rises dramatically, and glucose stays high almost the entire curve. Now, on pattern 5, watch for insulin along the bottom of the chart. And so you can see here how insulin resistance is progressive, and that where in that progression your patient is currently functioning, we can see that in this test. And the great thing about this is that we can also see regression with effective treatment and improvement of insulin sensitivity. I've heard Dr. Wright say that in using this test, he's been able to detect insulin resistance or confirm insulin resistance where he suspected it, sometimes up to 7 years before he would ordinarily have been able to catch insulin resistance with other tests. Okay, here's an example of a 58-year-old man and his values on the glucose tolerance insulin response test. His fasting glucose looks great. His fasting insulin is well within what most labs would call the normal range of less than 30. His insulin peaked at the second hour and got high enough to result in hypoglycemic levels of glucose at the third and fourth hours. Even at the fourth hour, his insulin levels had not returned to its original fasting level, even though his glucose was low by then. This person had a normal fasting insulin and glucose at the high end of the normal range. His insulin peaked at 1 hour, but his second hour was more than 50, and his second plus third hour was more than 100, and his fourth hour was more than 10. This is a pattern 2 with definite insulin resistance. Notice that his 2-hour glucose would have been evaluated as completely normal by American Diabetic Association criteria. And here's an example of testing allowing for early intervention leading to a reversal of insulin resistance. Notice that on this person's initial test, they would have tested as normal based on the ADA criteria. A 2-hour glucose was well below 140. Also, using the single fasting insulin as a screen would not have detected this person, or would not have detected insulin resistance in this person. Yet the insulin response levels were really quite high. 2-hour was well above 50, and the second hour plus a third hour was over 200. Remember that a second and a third hour more than 100 is definite insulin resistance. 8 months later after treatment, the same person had a completely normal glucose tolerance insulin response test with improved fasting insulin and glucose, an insulin peak at a half an hour, 2-hour of less than 50, 2-hour plus 3-hour of less than 60, and a 4th hour falling down to a nice fasting level. So that's complete reversal from definite insulin resistance to completely normal in 8 months with treatment. And I have a question here. Is there a point of no return to normal? Well, I think that depends a little bit on your philosophy. I'm kind of the never say never, glass half full kind of person. So I always think that there's something we can do to improve things. When someone gets down to an insulinopenic pattern where they're barely producing any insulin at all, is it going to be much harder to return them to a normal pattern? Yes, if they can be returned to a normal pattern at all. But I would never say that it's impossible. I would just never say it's impossible. That's not my nature. But yes, the further along someone is in their progression, the harder it is to return to a normal place, which is why it's so important to detect this early on when you can make the most difference. Oh, there we go. Okay, so we know that exercise increases insulin sensitivity. Skeletal muscle is about 40% of human body mass and accounts for 50 to 75% of insulin-stimulated glucose uptake. This makes it the most important tissue regarding insulin-stimulated glucose disposal and maintenance of glucose homeostasis. After exercise, the ability of insulin to stimulate glucose uptake in active muscle is markedly improved. This is most likely due to significant improvement of GLUT4 translocation to the cell membrane after exercise. And exercise independently improved regulation of glucose in both healthy and patients with type 2 diabetes. So the question is, moderate or vigorous? We know that high-intensity, short-duration exercise can have remarkable benefits, as so well illustrated in Dr. Al Sear's book, PACE, which stands for Progressively Accelerating Cardiopulmonary Exertion. This is an excellent book which is very accessible to patients and is illustrated with lots of case studies and before and after pictures. It also has enough documentation of the research behind the program to make it useful, at least as a starting place for healthcare professionals. So I was somewhat surprised to find research that suggests that moderate intensity exercise was better for improving some parameters of metabolic syndrome than vigorous exercise. I just came across this research last night when finishing up this section of the webinar. These results were from the STRIDE study, that is, studies targeting risk reduction intervention through defined exercise. And they found that moderate intensity was better. Now, I think the takeaway message here is that some exercise is going to be better than none, and more is probably better than only some, and probably that there is a place for both high intensity interval type training and a more moderate intensity exercise. There's probably a place for both of those, and they have different benefits. Patients who lose weight show increased mitochondrial density, increased insulin sensitivity, weight loss of 7.1% of body fat in diabetic patients resulted in a decrease of hemoglobin A1C from 7.9 to 6.5. That's pretty significant. Also decreased fasting glucose and decreased postprandial glucose. And I have a question here, is that weight or fat mass weight? And I think you're referring to the weight loss of 7.1% body fat. It looks to me that that is 7.1% of body fat, not 7.1% of body weight. And I would have to go back to the actual study to get to confirm that, but that's what it looks like to me. So for sleep, we want to improve the quality of sleep. We want to improve the quantity of sleep. People who sleep less than 6 hours or people who sleep more than 9 hours are more likely to develop insulin resistance. Improve the timing of the sleep. So people who are not sleeping early enough in the evening, like going to bed at midnight or 1 o'clock, if you can get them going to bed at 11 o'clock or 10 o'clock, that's going to be much better for them. I've been told, and I have no idea where to find research backing this up, that the sleep, for every hour of sleep you get before midnight, it's worth 2 hours after midnight. I don't know if we can demonstrate that scientifically. Maybe somebody's done some work on that. But I know that when I go to sleep earlier, like around 10 o'clock, it's much more refreshing sleep. You want to treat sleep apnea. Also want to treat high cortisol, which can interfere with sleep if that's an issue for the person. You can give them melatonin, and of course one of the things that can make a big difference is meditation. So this is something that's pretty in the action. Yes, there is, and I would refer you again to Dr. Wright and Dr. Gabe. Been found that it improves fasting glucose, human studies, same thing, also increases insulin sensitivity and insulin secretion. There's actually several studies out, and this may not I have a question here. Are these herbs going to have any effect if very little insulin is being produced? What do you see as the highest priority of treatment if insulin response is flat? Well, I would say if insulin response is flat, is probably, well, improving insulin sensitivity in any way I can. So certainly vitamin D, supporting the mitochondria, having the patient lose weight if weight is an issue, which it probably is. I have another comment here. Key is feeding mitochondria and stimulating new mitochondrial growth. So CoQ10, also carnitine, I think would be important if you're going to be supporting the mitochondria. I have another comment here. I like holy thistle better than milk thistle. Great, I'm not familiar with that one. That's a good one to know about. And someone else says green drinks and the like other than wheatgrass. And someone else says stem cells if the insulin response is flat. So that might be a very useful intervention to consider, is stem cells if the insulin response is flat. Okay. Now this treatment section was not exhaustive, and I know that. I think that's probably the information most of you have the most access to. I really wanted you to see the background and understand the insulin resistance, the glucose tolerance insulin response test. So in summary, metabolic syndrome is multifactorial, includes insulin resistance, central adiposity, atherogenic dyslipidemia, endothelial dysfunction. We want to promote good maternal nutrition in the interests of prevention for future generations, treat the liver as all good holistic practitioners would always do, support the mitochondria, and promote good sleep. Red flags include family history, increased waist-hip ratio, increased waist circumference, shift work, sleep apnea, lack of exercise, gallstones, PCOS. And as I said before, that's not an exhaustive list. Lab red flags: elevated fasting glucose, fasting insulin more than 10, hemoglobin A1C more than 5.7, pardon me, low T to E ratio, high 5-alpha reductase activity, high normal ALT, elevated C-reactive protein. The ADA criteria miss early developing insulin resistance and at the time when interventions will make the most difference. Glucose tolerance and insulin resistance testing is sensitive and can distinguish progression in insulin resistance, and this allows for detecting insulin resistance years earlier than it can be detected using other tests. Early detection leads to early intervention, which can reverse insulin resistance. Any other questions? Oh, I see the questions popping up here. So here's one. Sometimes you said insulin is high at more than 10 and sometimes at 30. Which is which? Okay, Dr. KRAFT'S original research was done with he considered a normal fasting insulin as being less than 30. And that's what most conventional labs generally consider a normal fasting insulin, up to 30. But people who've been working with this are really looking at a normal fasting insulin optimally being less than 10. So if someone has a fasting insulin of more than 10, it's very unlikely that any of the rest of their GTIR profile is going to be normal. So in terms of conventional labs, less than 30 is normal, but in terms of what's really optimal, what we're looking for, less than 10. Can we get a copy of the slideshow? Yes, I'll let you know how to do that in just a minute. Let's see. In treating increased blood glucose, what should the target be? 125, 180? I like to go for somewhere in the mid-80s, around 84 or so. I don't know why 84, but that seems like a good number to me. Certainly, I don't think that it's normal all the way up to 99. And certainly when it gets above 90, I'm telling my patients, this is something you really should be watching. But as I showed you, you can have really great-looking glucose and even really great-looking fasting insulin, and it doesn't mean that you're not insulin resistant. So I think doing the glucose tolerance insulin response test, if there are any red flags at all about how someone manages their glucose, I think that that should be done to really assess where they are in that progression. Can we watch this again? Yes, this will be posted on the website shortly after we finish broadcasting. How do we change incorrect dogma? That's a great question. I think it's beyond the scope of this webinar, but I love the question, and I'm not going to answer it because I don't know. Okay, so I hope you found this webinar useful. If you're not already a customer of Meridian Valley Lab, I invite you to set up an account with us and try our tests. When you sign up as a new customer, you'll receive 50% off our most comprehensive hormone panel for your personal use, or you can use that 50% off another of the tests that we do in-house, such as the food allergy panels or the blood viscosity test or the glucose tolerance insulin response test. We usually say the comprehensive hormone panel because it's the most comprehensive one, but you could use it for any test that we do in-house. Also, I want to let you know that every test you do comes with a free consult with one of our consulting physicians. There are 4 of us on staff, and we're here to answer your questions about the best test to order for your patients and to help you interpret the results and recommend treatments when you get the results. Okay, this is what you've been waiting for. How do you get a copy of today's presentation? I promised I'd tell you that. You'll be getting an email from Meridian Valley Lab shortly. Open it up and click on the link to the webinar survey. It's a short survey. It shouldn't take you more than about 5 minutes, unless you have a lot you want to say. Complete the survey online and submit it, and as our thank you to you for your feedback, we'll send you a PDF copy of the presentation. Again, thank you for attending the webinar. Please don't forget to register for next month's webinar on PCOS with Dr. Leah Paz, our senior consulting physician. That will be on June 21st at 11 a.m. And thank you again very much for joining us.